it gives me great pleasure to introduce Callum Brown talking about the marvellously titled Spies, Sex and the Bomb, which has obviously drawn you all here. Callum Brown is a professor of history at the University of Glasgow and the author of a mere 14 books on the rise of humanists and the decline of religion. Becoming Atheist, 2017, used oral history to examine people's roots from religion to humanism. The Battle for Christian Britain, 2019, showed how conservative Christians feared humanists in the 1950s and 1960s. And the humanist movement in modern Britain, co-written with David Nash and Charlie Lynch and published in 2023, showed how Humanists UK evolved with vigour from religious change. He's currently the holder of a Leverhulme Research Fellowship, researching the humanist impact on ethical change in Britain from 1930 to 1980. And without further ado, Callum Brown.
Thanks to Maddie, whose work on the Humanist Heritage website has been inspirational, and particularly her uncovering of some long-forgotten women in the humanist movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which has helped me a great deal with some names I didn't know about. So it's a great joy for me to be introduced by her today. In 2017, Andrew Copson and the late David Pollock approached me, asking me to bid for a contract to write a history of the British humanist movement from the creation of the first ethical union in 1896 through to its 125th anniversary in 2021. With a colleague, David Nash at Oxford Brookes, put in a bid, and thankfully it was accepted. And we had very generous funding. And indeed, today I have met the treasurer who signed the cheque. Thank you very much, if you're present. The project that we undertook from 2017 through to the publication of that book 2 months ago, book, by the way, is on sale in the foyer. I always wanted to say that. And if anybody happens to buy one and would like me to sign it on behalf of the authoring team, I'll gladly do so after this. The interruption of COVID took its toll upon us. The project got delayed. The book was not out in time for 2021. Here it is 2 years later. We also had, I must note, a research assistant who suffered a cerebral hemorrhage in the middle of our project. She was touch and go for 6 weeks, but thankfully she survived, although she was forced to retire entirely from work. So this has been a team effort, this book. I'm the lead writer, but with 3 research assistants, including the last one, Charlie Lynch, who became a co-author on the book. We think we've produced an important record of developments, arguments, policies of the humanist movement from 1896 to the 2020s. Today, I'm going to concentrate on one very small area that features in the book, and it's not a big feature in the book, but I do intend to publish this elsewhere, which is the interest of MI5 in British humanists. And so, the impact of the humanist movement on the British state, notably in the area of social policy and ethical legislation, which is the subject of the book, also included interest by the state in what humanists, ethicists, secularists were doing in certain policy areas which impinged upon the work of the state. From the 1910s onwards, led mainly by MI5, now more correctly referred to as the Security Service, and the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, undertook considerable surveillance of many atheist scientists, writers, journalists. The surveillance was intrusive. involving post office letter intercepts, GPO telephone tapping, and including in serious cases, house burglary. One humanist had his house burgled so that MI5 could ascertain whether a certain letter had been written on a particular typewriter. In more serious cases, they undertook bugging of both homes and offices. Their modus operandi, just so that you know, is that in meeting rooms, the bug was placed underneath the table, so you know where to check. Files were opened on hundreds of individuals linked to humanist and kindred bodies. They're known in MI5 as PF, or personal files, PF. Many of those who had files taken out on them were members of the Ethical Union, the Rationalist Press Association, and the South Place Ethical Society, but also included some members of the National Secular Society. MI5 interest in humanists increased dramatically from the early 1930s and then reached fever pitch in the 1940s at the start of the Cold War in 1946. By 1990, the perceived problem on part of MI5 had shrunk as the Cold War ended in 1989. Also, as sexual freedoms grew and were accepted, and being without religion was popularised and normalised. As a result, in recent years, in the last 10 years, there's been a gradual opening of MI5 personal files, or person files. These have been open to scrutiny, and in recent years, increasingly in the last 5 years, they have been digitally copied, and you can now download them from the Q website. They did charge initially £3 a file, but with COVID, they decided to make a special offer to scholars and others, and you can get it for free now. 10 files a day you can download, and can I say, it's jolly good fun. So, being a humanist is now so normalised, widely accepted. It's difficult to understand how it might have been considered a danger in the early part of the 20th century. I want to start to explain the operation of the system. First of all, this is the copy of the book, that's a picture of the book that's outside for sale. Beside an image of the library in South Place. I keep calling it South Place Ethical Society. I know it's the Conway Hall Ethical Society, but I'm old school, and it's difficult to get rid of the old name. Here are two files. This is what an MI5 person file looks like. The big number, the KV, is a modern catalogue number, which KV2 indicates all the MI5 person files. The origins of serious MI5 interest in humanism really dates from the 1910s. Triggering it was a book by a leading humanist, J.A. Hobson, who was one of the lecturers at South Place, published a book called Imperialism, a Study. In this, Hobson made a study of the Boer War, combining interest in economic, ethical, and religious elements of the war, and proposing a grand doctrine of underconsumption as the root of imperialism. Namely, British capitalists were making so much money that they could not invest it fast enough in the British economy, and thus they came to invest in the empire, and thereby propelled colonial expansion. This, Hobson argued, was the root of imperialism. This investment led inevitably, he argued, to coercion, exhibited especially by Britain in the incarceration of Boers in concentration camps in South Africa, a fact exposed in the Manchester Guardian by another humanist intellectual, Emily Hobhouse. Many people were influenced by Hobson's book, which was the first real work of humanist theory. For one thing, it influenced Lenin, which in due course, affirmed for MI5 a sense of there's something troubling here. Certainly Russian émigré communists and anarchists had collected in London in the 1880s and 1890s, and some became invited speakers and attenders at South Place, including Peter Kropotkin, whose picture appears on the right-hand side of this slide. Kropotkin in 1895 spoke at South Place in aid of the Building Debt Fund. So the organisation of South Place is partly minuscule funding came from a Russian anarchist. More directly and importantly, the Hobson book was seen as a major intellectual theory proposing opposition to the British Empire, for it being unethical and something that all right-minded ethicists should oppose. It became a bestseller amongst British intellectuals, especially in the left wing of the Labour Party and the Independent Labour Party. Shaped the notion that imperialism itself was unethical, founded on slavery and the slave trade, and exploitation of people of colour across the world. So British humanists, very quickly in the early part of the 20th century, placed anti-colonialism at the forefront of the movement. This was cemented in the humanist tradition by the first major meeting organised by humanists, the 1911 First Universal Racist Congress, held at the University of London. This is a photograph incorporating some of the leading speakers and overseas delegates, many of them heads of state. It was attended by some 2,000 people, including some kings and queens, but of interest to us now, it included some leading intellectuals: Mahatma Gandhi, W.E.B. Du Bois, Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, Annie Besant, and Andrew Carnegie. So I put four of them on that slide. From that point on, Gandhi became very well known to leading British humanists, and there was constant contact throughout his life. Also with Du Bois, who was an intellectual leader of black freedom movement in the United States. There were others of interest at this meeting. One was Ramsay MacDonald, Prime Minister at two different points in the 1920s and 1930s, who I've argued in that book for sale out in the foyer as being the most politically influential humanist of the early 20th century. He's not looked very favourably upon by the left wing of the Labour Party, but there's good cause for the ethical movement to think he was an influential and important figure. He helped to found, and some people have attributed him with the foundation itself, of an organisation called the Union of Democratic Control, founded in 1913, which became a mass movement of some 300,000 people dedicated to refusal to fight in the First World War and to attribute the war itself as a capitalist conflagration which the people of Britain and Germany and other countries were going to rue the consequences. The UDC attracted big names. A young Bertrand Russell, actually younger than in that photograph, and Fenner Brockway. Many of you will know that there's a statue to Brockway and a bust of Russell together in the garden outside Conway Hall. The two most, probably looking back, influential figures in terms of popular appeal in relation to pacifism and the war. To be a conscientious objector in the First World War was not a pleasant experience. Many COs, as they were called, or conches, came from religious backgrounds, notably the Quakers. And instead of fighting, for some COs, there was a willingness to act as ambulance workers on the front lines at the trenches. Many Friends ambulance units were actually packed with ethicists, rationalists, atheists, and agnostics. And it's often not recalled just how important the predecessors in this movement were to that Conchi work. Refusing to fight led to alliance with labour movement members committed to the Brotherhood of Workers. And in turn, they were influenced by key humanists. Brockway was very influential in this, but at an intellectual level, Bertrand Russell carried more weight. He was already a well-known figure in the world of mathematics, but he was also beginning to move into philosophical work, which he became more famous for later on. And he made a big impression on public affairs during the First World War, touring Britain, giving speeches in favour of conscientious objection. His biggest and for him most satisfying audience comprised coal miners. Wherever he went in the First World War, he found coal miners were the most assiduous listeners who didn't walk up or walk out and didn't drink during his speeches. He particularly enjoyed speaking to them in South Wales and in Lanarkshire. The emergent MI5 ensured his every speech was written down verbatim. Every speech he gave, it is alleged, there was at least one MI5 operative or special branch one taking verbatim his speech. In 1916, he was summoned for his first interview with MI5. And it was an interview with its head, Vernon Kell, known as K, and after which every head became known as K. You can see he was a military man, and he spoke very sternly to Russell, asking him not to speak again to miners and trying to encourage them not to fight. Bertrand Russell refused, and MI5 quickly moved beyond mere surveillance of Bertrand Russell to taking secret action. Russell made a big speech in late 1916 at a hall in Cardiff called Corey Hall, which I think has been demolished now, although I found a photograph of it online. This was a major speech with several thousand miners present. In the middle of Russell's speech, a very large number of what were called patriot men arrived and with clubs attacked all miners present. We now know that the invasion of the patriots, because of, it's noted in Bertrand Russell's MI5 file, we now know that the attack by the patriots was organized by MI5 itself. In a nearby congregational church had collected a group of men who were patriots and who were willing to fight. And they were told how to fight by MI5, who then led them around the streets to go into Corey Hall. Also by 1916, MI5 had installed permanent and very effective surveillance of a new organization promoting conscientious objection, the National Council for Civil Liberties. Indeed, Kell, as head of MI5, came to know more about the membership and management of the NCCL than its own secretary. He received a 30-page secret financial analysis from NCCL's bankers, Barclays Bank. And Barclays Bank told things to MI5 which they never told to NCCL, including a list of all people who gave money and subscriptions to NCCL, including, by the way, secret donations. The leaders of the NCCL didn't know who the secret donors were, but MI5 did. By the war's end, MI5 had used the NCCL membership data to penetrate many groups of radicals and communists and members of the labour movement, but also progressive humanists. Persons of interest cards were opened on them all, and many moved on to having PF files. There were several thousand PF files by 1919. And the initial group did contain socialists and communists, but the biggest group were those of liberal humanists, particularly those with liberal, they regarded themselves as liberal voters. At the war's end, MI5 continued to identify leading figures, notably Bertrand Russell and his wife Dora Russell. Russell and Dora went on trips in 1920-21 to both Moscow to visit Lenin and to China to meet radicals there. Similarly, MI5 had their attention drawn to the writer and humanist H.G. Wells, who in 1934 met Stalin in Moscow. And his interview with Stalin was published in the New Statesman. MI5 files on these famous men have never been opened. So we don't have them for Russell. We don't have them for H.G. Wells. But they did exist, most definitely. From those files that have been opened, it is clear that MI5 became hyper-interested in the circle of humanist radicals in the years 1931 to 1934, many of whom were linked to the Bloomsbury group of radical authors and artists. There was an interconnection between a network of humanist radicals and the artistic radicals of Bloomsbury. And a key humanist figure of this, perhaps not as well known in the history of the humanist movement as he should be, was the journalist Kingsley Martin. From 1931 to 1960, a remarkably long period, Kingsley Martin was the editor of the weekly political magazine New Statesman. And in the magazine, Martin fostered and nurtured a mixture of socialism and humanism. And as he got older, it is my judgment that he became more humanist and less socialist, particularly in the late 1940s and the 1950s. But in 1931, Martin was part of a significant trend for radical humanists to visit the USSR, using official in-tourist tours, which were subsidized by the Soviet state. And Martin went with his wife, Dorothy Woodburn, who was a specialist on the Far East, who also had an MI5 file, and also a radical cartoonist called Lowe, who I haven't been able to trace his file yet, but I'm convinced he did have one. So also the economist and later the criminologist Barbara Wootton, who became Baroness Wootton in 1959 and became the first woman to sit on the woolsack in the House of Lords. Many humanists, notably female ones, became involved in campaigning for sexual freedoms. Wootton was one of these. They campaigned for better sex education in schools, for when it became was invented, for the wider availability of the contraceptive pill and its free availability to children as well as to adult women. And she was initially strongly in favour of decriminalisation of abortion, though she subsequently changed her mind. But she was also a supporter of the decriminalisation of male homosexuality, which was a key humanist policy of the 1950s and 1960s. She also was instrumental in putting forward the lowering of the age of majority from 21 to 18 in 1969. There was also key humanist involvement in the reform of marriage and divorce laws, a fact which deserves better appreciation. Most well known, perhaps, Kingsley Martin used the pages of new statesmen to discuss and publish not just these humanist ideas, but also key developments in the history of pacifism. It was Martin who engineered the creation of CND in 1958, and that is one of the arguments of the book which is for sale. Much of the existing literature suggests that the CND was promoted and organized by radical Christians. There were radical Christians who were co-opted onto the executive committee, but the first executive committee was called by Kingsley Martin in his home in London. He used various key members of the literati, of the intellectual classes, to conduct writing exercises which would penetrate various demographic groups. With the foundation of CND in 1958, he had Bertrand Russell on board as the key intellectual figure to write for pacifism. But he also had other figures. These were some of the organizations which were promoted by Martin in New Statesman. Another one was the formation of CND, was promoted by the Bradford-born playwright J.B. Priestley, who in 1957 proposed unilateral nuclear disarmament. This drew MI5 and Special Branch surveillance immediately upon J.B. Priestley and quite a number of other artistic members of CND. For 20, 30 years, every ship, every aircraft which the leading members of the humanist movement boarded or got off was being watched by MI5 and Special Branch. Every time they landed in a ship at London or Southampton, or landed at London Airport, they were being carefully watched and their baggage taken behind the search area, where they were searched for literature, particularly Russian literature, which Special Branch delighted in saying, we found 3 books in Russian. We couldn't read them. But they were still proud of having found them. People added to the list of those of interest to MI5 rarely lost MI5's interest. Once on, you were on largely for life. The 2 most important premises for permanent MI5 surveillance were the headquarters of the NCCL, what is now Liberty, which fights for justice, and the Communist Party of Great Britain, which was then headquartered in Covent Garden. Both of these places were not only sound-wired, but also had permanent Special Branch observers outside recording who was going in and coming out, and no doubt being photographed. Interestingly, I have not found any evidence that Ethical Union HQ offices or South Place at Conway Hall were permanently bugged. But Conway Hall was certainly the object of considerable interest to both Special Branch and Conway Hall. Notably at the Freethinkers Congress of 1938 that was held in Conway Hall, and there were numbers of European communists as well as Soviet communists attending. In the Second World War and then through the Cold War from 1946 to 1989, MI5 surveillance of humanists continued, special interest falling upon nuclear and biological scientists. These included the mathematician Jacob Bronowski, the physicist Joseph Rotblat, the ophthalmologist and biochemist Antoinette Pirry, the zoologist and anatomist Solly Zuckerman, the physicist and inventor Patrick Blackett, mathematician and inventor of floating docks J.D. Bernal, and evolutionary biologist, mathematician and inventor Jack Haldane. Of these, only the last 2, Bernal and Haldane were demonstrably serious communist sympathizers who were openly feted by the USSR and its scientists. But not one of the humanist scientists that I've identified was ever recorded in opened MI5 files as having established a communist credential or a communist evidence that he or she was a communist agent. There is no evidence any of these reached that accolade. Many humanists, including a large number of these, served in important positions in secret wartime work against Nazi Germany. Humanist pacifism was suspended during the Second World War because fascism was seen as a more serious evil than fighting war. Some became experts in particular spheres of war effort. Bernal and Bronowski, in 1945-46, in the late years in the Second World War, were both mathematicians who improved the aerial bombing of Britain in the war by the use of mathematical algorithms. Bronowski in 1945-46 was put in charge of the British and American assessment of the effectiveness of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were others, that's just skipped. There were others who were also active. I'll just mention one, Peter Ritchie Calder, who was a leading science journalist and strong humanist, who from the 1930s to the 1970s worked both for the state and for humanism. For the state, he was in charge of black science propaganda during the Second World War to fool the Nazis into thinking that Britain had certain capabilities which it may not have had. With MI5 information being shared with the FBI after 1945, and also later with CIA, the Americans constantly pushed for more serious blocking of some of these humanist scientists, including closing down their ability to move freely to scientific posts in the States. And in one case, in Solly Zuckerman's case, and also Bronowski, the FBI persuaded the British state government to withhold visas to visit the United States. Can I just add that in this work, there is clear evidence that MI5 and Special Branch were both riddled with anti-Semitism. Jacob Bronowski had an MI5 file created for him in 1941 because of an anonymous informant saying that Bronowski had books by left-wingers in his house, and was described by a Hull city police constable, where Bronowski was employed as a lecturer. He was described as, quote, a Jewish intellectual type, a phrase I've found several times in MI5 files. If anything, American FBI and CIA were more paranoid about the role of Jews than was the British security forces. The chief example here is the case of Joseph Rotblat, who was a British naturalized atomic scientist who was part of the Manhattan bomb project in the States, who decided in 1944 to leave the project when all the scientists were told by the FBI that the Nazis were not on track to perfect an atomic bomb. He decided that news removed the ethical justification for developing a bomb, because there would be only one state in the world with it, namely the USA. At that juncture, Rotblat was the object of considerable surveillance by the FBI, who became convinced that because Rotblat was taking lessons in how to fly a light plane in the American Deep South, he was about to jump ship with documents from the Manhattan Project and pass them over and fly to the Soviet Union and pass the documents over. He never did any such thing. Rotblat and Antoinette Piri became famous after the war, becoming experts in nuclear fallout and its impact on the human body. And in the 1950s, they exposed us to the public, notably through a panorama program, one of the very first panorama programs in the early 1950s, which the BBC amazingly was allowed to make and broadcast without any interference from MI5. I think it was just incompetence that allowed it through. And in that program, Rotblat made the case that the worst element of the government's oversight of atomic bomb development was its failure to tell the people how long fallout would last in the human body and how many people it would kill. Rotblat in 1995 won the Nobel Prize for Peace for his work. In this way, MI5 became convinced that intellectuals of all sorts were a threat to national security. This was even more the case for special branch officers. Many leading Jewish intellectuals like Bernowski, Zuckerman, Rotblat were also humanists, and this continued into the 1950s and 60s to inflame official views of humanists. More generally, the word intellectual was used disparagingly by MI5 and by Special Branch. This, I think, is caused in large part by the origins of Special Branch and MI5 officers. Special Branch officers were overwhelmingly police. A very small number of graduates were in Special Branch, one of whom was transferred to MI5 and subsequently became a most important figure in trying to trace a man called Gordon Liddell, tried to trace the third man in the 1950s. MI5 officers came from a variety of backgrounds, but a significant proportion were ex-military, including in the 1950s, when they were rarely sympathetic to understanding intellectuals of any hue. There's been a growing work amongst historians concerning MI5's obsession with intellectuals of various types, journalists, writers, poets, artists, over both their politics and their sex lives. There was a considerable focus put on who was sleeping with whom in the radical movement. And some were sexual radicals as well. We are far from having a complete picture of the secret state's secret observation of humanist intellectuals. Most files are only open until 1958. They remain closed after that year in most cases. And some individual files have neither been admitted to nor open. I know for a fact that files existed for key humanists because I found the cross-reference numbers to them in other files, but they're not opened. So there are files which I know exist for H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, and many of the humanists in the House of Commons and the House of Lords have not been admitted to, let alone opened. I think in the case of those in Parliament, an argument may have been floated that many of the humanists in Parliament were considered national treasures, and even to this day it would be considered improper for the secret state to admit that they were under surveillance as possible traitors. Another point, so far it is difficult to discover if MI5 had a philosophical position on humanism. Can I bring up one example here? Lord Chorley was a very prominent member of the Ethical Union. He was the first chairman of the Humanist Housing Association, and he most definitely had an MI5 file because I've got his PF number. What we don't know is, did MI5 consider humanism as an ideology in itself a danger to the state? There were certainly key individuals who were undertaking work which was considered as opposed to the desires and wishes of the British government, particularly in the decline of empire in the 1950s. Many humanists worked in conjunction with liberation movements in the colonies. People like Gerald Gardner, who became a Labour Lord Chancellor, Fenner Brockway, a man called Dennis Pritt, They went to defend freedom fighters in courts in Kenya, South Africa, and elsewhere. And for doing that work, were seen to be potentially opposing the policy of the British state. MI5 was fixated on the possible treachery of intellectuals. In the minds of MI5, the elision of intellectualism with various radical sympathies was enough to put many British humanists on the watch list. Probably not because their humanism per se was of significance, but the positions they took that made them humanists. Certainly, MI5 got themselves into fankles of confusion in their surveillance and analysis. And I'll finish on this. In 1949, MI5 intercepted a letter to the British Communist Party HQ in Covent Garden, which contained a small clipping from a newspaper application to join the Communist Party. The applicant's name, typed onto it, and this is it, was Professor S. Zuckerman, Solly Zuckerman, who was a professor of anatomy at the University of Birmingham. And there was his address, 6 Carpenter Road, Birmingham. And that's the house concerned. Zuckerman then became subject to 6 months of intense surveillance to find out through letter intercepts, telephone intercepts, and visual surveillance by Birmingham City Special Branch whether he had any links to communists. The longer it went on, the more suspicious MI5 became that this was actually a prank by somebody. And MI5 searched for a culprit who might harbour bad feelings against Professor Zuckerman. And they came upon the name of Professor Lancelot Hogben, also a humanist. In order to try and test whether there was a case for Zuckerman and Hogben not liking each other, Birmingham's Special Branch put a University of Birmingham graduation ceremony in the garden party under surveillance. And they noted that Solly Zuckerman and Lancelot Hogben did not speak to each other. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to graduation ceremonies, but I can tell you that academics ain't got time to chat with each other at such occasions. They've got to chat with the parents. This was a ludicrous situation. It took a full 10 years before Zuckerman was completely cleared of suspicion of possibly being a communist agent, and he became chief advisor, scientific advisor to the government. But Zuckerman's career, like that of Bernowski before him, was significantly impacted on the basis of specious information collected by servants of the state who didn't have a clear idea of what humanism was. Thank you very much.